Da neste foredrag, det Rachel Hurley fra NIVA. Og da kommer vi over I den mikroplasten fra jord til vann. Og nå så var det jo makroplast fra nedbørsfeltet til vann. Og ja, vær så god, Rachel.
Yes, this is working great. It does have a low battery light, but we'll see if it survives. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I have to apologize in advance for speaking in English. I am not yet at the level to do this in Norwegian, quite far from that level, unfortunately. But hopefully, I'm sure you're all absolutely fine with this, but I do apologize for not being able to speak Norwegian. And yes, as Cecil introduced, I will talk a little bit about how microplastics from agricultural settings can end up in sort of connected aquatic systems. So I thought I'd start off by giving some backgrounds about some of the sources of microplastics to agricultural environments. So wastewater treatment plants receive microplastics from many different sources. Some examples of these, the sort of main contenders are often the synthetic textile fibers from laundry processes, plastics in personal care products and other products that contain microplastics such as detergents or paints that are washed in the sink, for example. Many fragments from kind of larger plastic items, and these are just anything that ends up down the sink effectively. So anytime we're using plastic in the home, if that gets washed into the sink, it can end up in a wastewater treatment plant. And then also depending on the connectivity of the wastewater treatment plants, some of these also receive, for example, industrial effluents that could contain large amounts of plastic, and some also are connected to road systems, for example, and may then receive some of the tire and road wear particles we've heard about earlier today. These wastewater treatment plants, they have several steps to cleanse this water and prepare it for release back into a recipient water body. The ability of these wastewater treatment plants to kind of capture and retain microplastics varies, and this depends on the treatment steps that are used. And these treatment steps vary sort of nationally, internationally, from one wastewater plant to the next. So it's quite hard to get an idea out about how, a specific step can retain microplastics for kind of generally in wastewater treatment plants. The ability to retain these particles also varies widely when we look at the wastewater treatment plants. So some, just a few tens of percentage of the particles are actually retained and the rest are released in this effluent. Other wastewater treatment plants can actually retain up to 99.9% of the microplastics. So there's actually a huge range there in terms of what these wastewater treatment plants can hold on to. But everything that's held onto has to end up somewhere, and in many of these wastewater treatment plants, a large portion of this ends up in the solid sludge phase, and that also needs to have a home. Something has to happen with that as well. So one of the sort of main endpoints for this sludge is agricultural lands. And this is for the purpose of conditioning soils. So for example, like amending the pH of soils, but also as a fertilizer. This contains a lot of nutrients, this material. And it's also important to note that yes, we as people, this population, we generate quite large amounts of this sludge every single day that needs to be dealt with. It's kind of like a large, heavy physical entity that we have to deal with. And applying it to land does represent quite a cheap solution for handling this waste, but also a cheap solution for these kind of soil conditioner or soil fertilizer for the farmers, sorry. Unfortunately, if it's enriched with microplastics from the wastewater treatment plants, it will represent a source or a release pathway for microplastics to soil environments. We had a little look at this in the Norwegian context, measuring microplastics in sludge from a variety of wastewater treatment plants across the country. And we're able to kind of scale this up over the course of 1 year to see how many microplastics are released to different environments in Norway. And this related to around 446 billion microplastics that are spread on agricultural soils, 112 billion particles that are sent to soil producers, and 27 billion particles that are added to green areas, adding up to 584 billion microplastics that are released into the Norwegian environment each year via sewage sludge. Unfortunately, that's not the only source. So that's these microplastics, these billions of microplastics are not the only ones entering agricultural soils. Another quite important source we've already heard a little bit about today, and that is agricultural plastics. So around 3 to 4 million tons of agricultural plastics are currently in use across Europe. About a third of this is for protected cultivation systems, usually in the form of thin films, so mulching films, also low tunnel systems, greenhouse systems like in the picture here as well. In addition to this, there are also plastics used in irrigation systems. Silage wraps are quite famous here in Norway, the wraps around hay bales that sometimes end up where they're not intended are called these sort of tractor eggs. And then there's also polymeric encapsulation of seeds and also plant protection products. For example, controlled or slow-release fertilizers. They're a kind of hollow plastic bead in which a kind of mineral fertilizer is added, and it can kind of come out over the duration of about a year and a half. But unfortunately, what is left is this hollow plastic shell that's then been added to the soils. All of these different sources, they add up to about 1 million tons of plastic waste that is generated each year across Europe. In addition to this waste, these plastics can degrade during their use and as they're removed, and also in terms of the handling of the waste after they've been sort of removed from the fields. There are sort of these direct additions to soils, that's the polymeric encapsulations, where we kind of intentionally add microplastics to soils and are not retrieving those. We've heard already about biodegradable plastics and the extent to which they may represent an alternative to conventional non-degradable plastics, but that we've already seen that they may represent a kind of a source of sometimes quite high levels of this transient microplastic that may persist in soils for kind of, depends on the soil conditions we found out, for a sort of unknown amount of time, depending on the location. There's a need to kind of better understand the importance, the relative importance of these different sources, including agricultural plastics. And this is important because we use these products for a reason, and we need to find a way to kind of use these sustainably so that we can balance kind of the needs for today, the production needs for today, versus the long-term sustainability of our soil systems. There are likely to be other sources as well to agricultural soils. Atmospheric deposition is well known kind of globally, and we have observed that even in remote regions of the world. Therefore, we can expect it to also occur on our agricultural fields. And then there's also compost, which can be produced from many different waste streams. And these waste streams also vary from country to country, but also regionally. And some of these have the potential to be pretty highly contaminated with microplastics. So one example of this is in Germany, all of the waste from supermarkets, all of the food waste is composted, and often the plastic packaging is not removed. It's just sort of macerated up, and there's very high levels of microplastic being detected in this compost type. We don't really have a good idea on the microplastics being added from, into relevant composts in all these different areas, all these different waste streams, and that represents an unknown in terms of sources of microplastics to agricultural soils. So those are kind of an overview of the sources, but I'm going to talk a bit now about what actually happens to these microplastics once they've been added to the soils, and what is their potential for contaminating connected aquatic systems. And I'm going to do this talking about 2 case studies that we did in a project a few years ago. First, a study in Spain, in Spanish soils, and then second, a case study from Canada. So first of all, this case study in Spain, we wanted to look at the role of surface runoff as a pathway for agricultural soils to be a source of microplastics to aquatic environments. This experiment was set up in an experimental farm system in Alcalá de Henares, which is just outside of Madrid in central Spain. It's quite an arid region. And we established these runoff plots. They're sort of modified Pinson collectors for anyone who's been involved in runoff studies before. But they allow us to isolate an area of soil and to capture all of the runoff material that is generated from that plot. So we had a 2 by 1 meter plot containing soil, and we collected all of the runoff material from every rainfall event that occurred over the course of 1 year. And we had 3 treatments involved. There was a control plot where there was no history of sludge application to the soil that was added. We had a kind of historic past sludge application plots where soils were translocated from a site where the sludge had been applied 4 years prior. And we had a kind of current sludge application plot where we actually directly added the sludge at sort of a relevant level in terms of the local agricultural plastics at the start of the experiment. We noted from the results that more microplastics were present in the runoff from the most recently treated soils. These microplastics were actually dominated by particularly low-density polymer types and also fragments in terms of the particle shape. And when we compared this to the kind of typologies of microplastic that were in the sludge that we added, but also the soil, we measured the microplastics in the soil as well. We were able to compare the kind of different shapes and sizes of microplastic. And we observed that in this runoff, there is a preferential mobilization of low-density particles, which makes sense in terms of the buoyancy of these particles, that when there is a rainfall event, they are kind of preferentially moved. But there's also this preferential retention of fibers. So these kind of complex morphologies, they tend to get stuck in the soil and they don't end up in the runoff. Moving on now to the case study in Canada. This was a slightly different setup, and we're actually using real fields and real farms here. And this was in the Ontario state, the Lake Simcoe watershed, which is sort of close to the border with the US. And so what we did there was we knew that they were going to apply sludge in these areas. We did an extensive coring activity, so 14 cores across the whole field at 3 different depths, and we would then composite each depth. So we would have this sample representing, for example, 0 to 5 centimeters across the whole field. And then we also had 5 to 10 centimeters and 10 to 15. And then the sludge application was performed, and then we went back and repeated this sampling experiment several times following the application of sludge. And we were able to then compare the levels in the different depths of the soil to see how microplastics were moving vertically, but also being exported from the field as well. We also had a control plot here to try and understand how the background levels of the soil and how these particles were moving. Taking a look at the results here, this plot shows just the change in microplastic concentrations, so not the total microplastic concentrations, but the change at each depth. For field 1, we saw this vertical transport of microplastics. So as you look kind of going across to the right of the graph, you see more of the microplastics, there's sort of a decrease from the blue, which is the upper surface layers, and an increase in the red and the green, which are the deeper surface layers. In field 2, a lot of those are below the 0 line, so we actually saw this net loss of microplastic, but when we compare the different depths, there's not much infiltration going on there either. It's sort of staying quite surface. And then in field 3, we also see this net loss of microplastic occurring across all 3 layers. We tried to sort of look into this a little bit, try and understand some of the mechanisms, and we saw that there's potentially a control related to the soil density on how much microplastic is lost over the course of this year. If we kind of scale these results up, so what's actually lost from these total runoff plots or these total fields over the course of 1 year, we found that in the Spanish case study, up to 99% of the microplastics that we added in the sewage sludge were retained by these soils after the 1 year duration. In contrast, just over 99% of the microplastics in the Canadian case study were actually exported from the fields, were lost from the fields over the same time period. So this shines a bit of a light on the potential variability in the capacity of soils to retain microplastic particles. We already identified that the density of the soil, so the soil texture, the soil structure, could be a variable that is relevant, but there's likely to be many other variables that will control the fate of these particles, related to, for example, how the sludge is applied to the land, how wet the soil was when it was added, how many rainfall events there have been, what the sort of saturation conditions of the soil are related to these rainfall events, and these still need to be investigated further. In terms of the implications for the environment, if the microplastics stay in the soils, like we saw for the Spanish case study, then successive inputs, so successive applications of sewage sludge or successive uses of agricultural plastics, could potentially lead to quite high concentrations over time as these particles are staying in the soils. On the other side, if microplastics are exported from these soils, then these soil environments will represent kind of release pathways for microplastics to other connected environments, including aquatic systems. So in this context of microplastics staying in the soils, these high concentrations, they could potentially lead to some negative effects. There are already studies that point towards negative, positive, and negligible effects on soils related to environmentally relevant microplastic concentrations. But if we keep adding microplastics to soils, then we might end up getting to quite elevated concentrations, and we will start to see an increase in potential negative impacts over time. This can be effects on soil properties. So you already start to see, for example, changes in soil pH, the way in which the soil is structured, so how aggregates can form, how moisture can move through the soils. And there will also be a point at which, if you keep putting microplastic into a soil and it doesn't get to go anywhere, those soils can't really bind at like an extreme level. And this is talking about, many, many years in the future, but if the microplastics stay there, this is something that is a reality if they are persistent and they are not being exported from the fields. There's also likely to be effects on soil organisms, so insects living in the soils, also the microorganism communities and their functions, and also then likely to be knock-on effects on plants related to how their roots can grow in this sort of altered soil structure, but then also leading on to kind of plant production, so what is the actual mass of plants that can be produced from agricultural environments. And if we look very far into the future, if we get to these high concentrations, this could ultimately result in a decline in soil health and fertility, and then impact upon food security. In terms of if they are exported from these fields, it obviously represents a release pathway. This is particularly relevant for biodegradable plastics, because it might mean a transfer of these materials to an environment in which they are not certified for biodegradability. So it might be an environment that they then are more likely to persist in. And finally, just the next steps of the research. We've answered just a few small questions on this topic, and there are many lingering knowledge gaps. We are now embarking on a much more thorough investigation of the fate of microplastic particles in agricultural soils. And we're looking at many different levels here, from the lab scale up to the field scale, from a high level of environmental control up to a high level of environmental realism. And this includes lab experiments, lab columns, a series of mesocosm experiments, which also will connect to stream mesocosms, so we can understand kind of the fate of these particles once they are inputted to streams. And finally, some large field plot experiments where we can kind of see how some of the mechanisms that we see in the lab and the mesocosm studies, how they actually play out in a kind of fairly realistic environment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rachel. Very interesting. And do you have some questions here? No? Do you know if there are any studies from Norway about this?
About the fates?
Yeah.
I think not too much on the fates just yet. Some will definitely come. There are some projects in the pipeline. So a lot of this stuff is being done across Europe. And we can apply some of those sort of broad trends to Norway, but because we saw this variability between Spain and Canada, it is important to kind of get an idea on what is relevant for the Norwegian context specifically. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you for a nice presentation, and here's a bag for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.